They called it the weapon that saved the Australian army. But here is what they never told you. The Bren gun was also the weapon that killed more diggers than any enemy sniper ever could. And the British knew it from the very beginning. 1941, North Africa. The temperature is pushing 50 degrees. Australian soldiers are surrounded, outnumbered, fighting for survival against Rommel's best troops. And the one weapon keeping them alive. It is literally cooking off rounds from the heat. Barrels so hot they melt gloves, mechanisms jamming with sand every 30 seconds, soldiers urinating on their guns just to keep them firing for one more minute. This is not the story you learned in school. This is not the polished version they show you in documentaries. This is the raw, brutal truth about the machine gun that the British Empire handed to Australian soldiers and said good luck. A weapon so temperamental, so demanding, so absolutely lethal to operate that being chosen as the Bren gunner was basically a death sentence. The average life expectancy in heavy combat. Minutes. Not hours, minutes. But here is the part that will blow your mind. The Australians took this flawed, overheating, sand-choking nightmare of a weapon and turned it into something that made the Germans refuse to attack certain positions. Japanese prisoners would literally ask if they had just fought the 9th Division because they were terrified of what Australian Bren gunners could do. Rommel himself mentioned Australian machine gun tactics in his personal notes. How did they do it? By ignoring every single rule in the British manual, by making modifications that would get them court-martialed, by developing techniques so brutal and improvised that when British officers saw them, they were horrified, and by paying a price that nobody talks about because it is too uncomfortable, too raw, too real. You think you know about World War II weapons? You think the Bren gun was just another reliable British design? Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you will change everything you thought you knew about how Australia actually fought and survived the Second World War. The official story is a lie. And the truth is so much darker and so much more incredible than anyone ever admitted. Tobruk, North Africa, 1941. The temperature hits 45 degrees Celsius in the shade, but there is no shade. Private Jack Morrison lies flat against the scorched earth, his hands wrapped around a Bren gun that feels like it was pulled straight from a furnace. The metal is so hot it burns through his gloves. 200 meters away, German armor rolls forward in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes. Morrison's section has been holding this god-forsaken position for 6 hours. They are out of water, they are nearly out of ammunition, and the Bren gun, the one weapon keeping them alive, is about to jam for the 3rd time that day. This is not the story you will find in British war manuals or American propaganda films. This is the raw truth about the machine gun that Australian soldiers loved, cursed, and depended on more than any other weapon in the Second World War. The Bren saved thousands of digger lives across the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of New Guinea, and the mountains of Greece. But it also betrayed them at the worst possible moments, overheated in the killing heat, choked on sand, and demanded constant, obsessive maintenance that no other Allied weapon required. The weapon arrived in Australian hands through typical British imperial logic. In the mid-1930s, the British Army needed a new light machine gun to replace the aging Lewis gun. They examined designs from across Europe and settled on a Czechoslovakian weapon, the WW2, manufactured in Brno. The British bought the license, modified it slightly, and began production at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield. Brno plus Enfield equals Bren. Simple mathematics for a weapon that would become anything but simple in the hands of soldiers who actually had to use it in combat conditions that defied every assumption the designers had made. Australian troops received their first Brens in 1938, just as the world was sliding toward another catastrophic war. The weapon looked impressive on paper. It fired the standard British .303 3-inch round, the same ammunition used in the Lee Enfield rifle that every Australian infantryman carried. It weighed only 10 kilograms when loaded, light enough for one man to carry and operate. The curved 30-round magazine sat on top of the weapon, an unusual design that gave the gunner a clear view of exactly how much ammunition remained. The rate of fire was controllable at around 500 rounds per minute, slow enough that a trained operator could fire single shots with remarkable accuracy. British training manuals described the Bren as the perfect infantry support weapon. Australian soldiers quickly discovered that British training manuals were written by people who had never fought in temperatures above 20 degrees or in environments where sand got into absolutely everything. The first real test came in the Western Desert, where the 9th Australian Division found itself surrounded at Tobruk, holding a perimeter against Rommel's Afrika Korps. The siege would last 241 days, and the Bren would prove itself in ways the British designers never imagined, while simultaneously revealing flaws that could get you killed if you did not learn to work around them. Sergeant Tom Derrick from Adelaide commanded a section during those brutal months. His unit held a section of the perimeter where German and Italian forces probed constantly, looking for weakness. Derrick's Bren became the centerpiece of his defense, but keeping it operational in the desert required skills that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with Australian ingenuity, born from generations of making do in harsh environments. The biggest enemy was not German bullets, but Australian heat and African sand that penetrated every crevice of the weapon's carefully engineered mechanisms. The Bren was designed for European battlefields where temperatures stayed moderate and mud was the primary concern. In North Africa, where daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 40 degrees and sand as fine as talcum powder filled the air, the weapon faced conditions that turned its brilliant engineering into potential death traps. The barrel would heat to temperatures that could literally cook off rounds before the trigger was pulled. The gas piston system would clog with sand after just a few dozen rounds. The magazine springs, calibrated for British weather, would weaken in the heat and cause feeding failures at exactly the wrong moment when German infantry were rushing your position. Derrick and soldiers like him developed a completely unofficial maintenance routine that would have horrified British armory sergeants but kept them alive. They learned to urinate on the barrel to cool it down during extended firefights. The ammonia in urine actually helped prevent corrosion, though nobody knew that at the time. They wrapped the magazines in cloth soaked with whatever liquid was available, usually tea if they had it, water if they were lucky, or more urine if they were desperate. They learned to fire in short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds maximum, allowing the barrel to cool between bursts even when every instinct screamed to keep the trigger pressed as enemy soldiers rushed their position across open ground. Official doctrine said to change the barrel after firing 6 magazines in rapid succession. In the heat of Tobruk, the barrel needed changing after 3 magazines, sometimes 2, but spare barrels were in short supply. Everything was in short supply during the siege that would become legendary in Australian military history. So the diggers learned to rotate between multiple Brens if they had them, letting one cool while firing another. If they only had one gun, they learned to pace their fire with a discipline that seemed impossible under the circumstances. Fire too fast, and the gun seized up into a useless hunk of metal. Fire too slow, and the Germans got through your position. The margin for error was measured in seconds and degrees of heat that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. But when the Bren worked properly, it was absolutely devastating in ways that terrified the enemy. The accuracy was unlike anything else in the Allied arsenal. An American Browning automatic rifle could throw more lead downrange, but it sprayed bullets in a general direction with limited precision. The Bren could be aimed like a rifle with shocking accuracy. At 300 meters, a skilled gunner could put rounds through a window or pick off individual soldiers advancing across open ground. This precision made it perfect for the defensive warfare that characterized the Tobruk siege, where every round counted and resupply was uncertain at best. German after-action reports from North Africa show a grudging respect for Australian Bren tactics that bordered on fear. Captured German officers reported that their men refused to advance across certain sectors because they knew Australian machine gunners were waiting in concealed positions. The Germans had faced British troops equipped with the same weapon, but they described the Australian use of the Bren as fundamentally different and far more lethal. British gunners followed doctrine, firing predetermined defensive fire patterns according to their training manuals. Australian gunners hunted their prey with patience and cunning. They would hold fire while German infantry crossed half the killing zone, then open up at a range where every round counted and escape was impossible. The curved magazine that sat on top of the Bren became one of its most recognizable features, but it also created problems nobody anticipated during the design phase. The design allowed the gunner to see exactly how many rounds remained, which was genuinely useful in combat, but it also made the weapon taller and harder to conceal in defensive positions. In defensive positions, Australian soldiers learned to dig their firing pits deeper than regulation to keep the distinctive silhouette below the sight line of German observers who were constantly scanning for targets. The magazine also caught on everything when soldiers were moving through trenches or tight spaces, snagging on barbed wire and door frames at exactly the moment when speed meant survival. Loading the curved magazines was an art form that required strong thumbs and infinite patience under conditions that offered neither. Each magazine held 30 rounds, and British doctrine said they should only be loaded with 28 to reduce spring tension and prevent jamming. In practice, Australian soldiers loaded all 30 because they needed every round when ammunition resupply was uncertain. The curved shape meant that bullets had to be pressed in at exactly the right angle, or they would jam and render the magazine useless. Try to load too quickly and you would bend the magazine lips, turning the magazine into scrap metal. In combat, soldiers had to reload while under fire, their hands shaking from adrenaline and fear, trying to press rounds into a curved magazine in the dark or through the smoke of battle while enemy soldiers advanced on their position. The weight of the Bren became legendary among Australian infantry who had to carry it across brutal terrain. 10 kilograms does not sound like much until you have carried it across 20 kilometers of desert under full combat load in 40-degree heat. The Bren gunner became the most important man in the section and the most burdened with responsibility and equipment. He carried the gun itself, at least 6 loaded magazines weighing another 7 kilograms, a spare barrel that added another 2 kilograms, and all his personal equipment on top of that crushing load. In the Pacific Theatre, where Australian soldiers fought across the Owen Stanley Range toward Kokoda, Bren gunners were carrying nearly 25 kilograms of weapon and ammunition up mountain tracks so steep that men were climbing on their hands and knees through mud and tropical vegetation. Private Bruce Kingsbury earned the Victoria Cross at Isurava in 1942, charging a Japanese position with his Bren firing from the hip in an attack that became legendary. The image of Kingsbury's final attack became iconic in Australian military history, but what the citations never mention is the physical impossibility of what he accomplished under fire. Firing a Bren from the hip while running uphill through jungle requires strength that borders on superhuman endurance. The weapon kicks upward and to the right with each shot, and controlling that recoil while moving over broken ground in tropical heat while Japanese bullets are snapping past your head is not something any training can prepare you for adequately. Kingsbury died moments after his charge succeeded, killed by a Japanese sniper who targeted him immediately. The Bren he was carrying was found still gripped in his hands when his body was recovered. The Japanese forces in the Pacific Theatre learned to fear the Bren just as much as the Germans did in North Africa, and their tactical responses showed that fear. Japanese infantry tactics relied on rapid movement through jungle terrain, getting close enough to use their superior numbers in hand-to-hand combat where their training gave them advantages. The Bren disrupted this tactic completely and forced the Japanese to change their entire approach. Australian soldiers would position their Brens to cover the narrow jungle tracks that Japanese forces had to use for their attacks. When the Japanese attacked in their typical banzai charges, the Bren would cut them down in horrifying numbers before they could close the distance. Japanese after-action reports describe Australian defensive positions as impossible to assault because of the devastating accuracy of machine gun fire that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. But the jungle environment created new nightmares for Bren crews that the desert had never prepared them for. The humidity caused metal parts to rust almost overnight, despite constant maintenance. Soldiers learned to coat every surface with gun oil mixed with whatever grease they could scrounge, creating a sticky mess that attracted insects and dirt, but prevented the catastrophic corrosion that could render a weapon inoperable. The tropical rain would fill the barrel with water, and firing a waterlogged Bren could cause a barrel burst that would kill the gunner and anyone standing nearby in a shower of metal fragments. Australian soldiers developed elaborate canvas covers and shelters to keep their Brens dry, but in the monsoon season on the Kokoda track, staying dry was a fantasy nobody could achieve. Everything was wet, everything rusted, everything broke down despite their best efforts. Ammunition became an obsession that consumed Bren crews with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. Each 30-round magazine represented 30 chances to stay alive in combat. Losing a magazine in combat was considered almost as serious as losing the gun itself, and men took extraordinary risks to prevent it. Soldiers would crawl back into killing zones under fire to retrieve dropped magazines from the mud or sand. They would search through the pockets of dead comrades, not for personal effects or keepsakes, but for Bren magazines that could be salvaged and reused. The curved shape of the magazine meant they could not simply grab a handful from an ammunition crate like rifle rounds. Each magazine had to be loaded individually, round by round, a process that took nearly 2 minutes for a full magazine, even when your hands were not shaking from combat stress. The Australians developed their own unofficial modifications to the Bren that would have voided any warranty and horrified British armoury inspectors if they had known. They learned that the bipod legs could be shortened by sawing off several centimetres, making the gun sit lower to the ground and harder to spot by enemy observers. This modification made the weapon less stable when firing, but more concealable, a trade-off that Australian soldiers considered worthwhile for survival. They learned that wrapping the barrel in strips of hessian soaked in water would keep it cooler for longer during sustained firing, though it also made the barrel shroud hot enough to cause severe burns if touched. They learned that the gas regulator could be adjusted beyond factory specifications to ensure the weapon kept firing even when clogged with mud or sand, though this also increased wear and made barrel bursts more likely to occur. The greatest weakness was also its greatest strength in a cruel mechanical paradox. The weapon was incredibly accurate because it fired from an open bolt with a very heavy bolt carrier that absorbed recoil. This meant that when the trigger was pulled, the bolt would slam forward, strip a round from the magazine, chamber it, and fire it in one smooth motion. The weight of the bolt carrier absorbed recoil and kept the barrel steady for precise shooting. But this mechanism also made the weapon sensitive to any interruption in its cycle. A single grain of sand in the wrong place could cause a stoppage that required immediate action. A slightly bent magazine lip would cause a feeding failure. A weakened recoil spring would cause the bolt to short stroke and fail to chamber the next round, leaving you with a single-shot weapon in the middle of a firefight. Clearing stoppages in combat was a skill that separated experienced Bren gunners from those who would get their sections killed through incompetence. The British manual listed a diagnostic sequence of checks to identify the cause of any stoppage methodically. Australian soldiers ignored this completely and developed their own brutal solutions. They developed a percussive maintenance technique that involved hitting specific parts of the weapon with the heel of their boot or the butt of their rifle while simultaneously working the cocking handle with violent force. This brutal method would make any armourer weep with professional horror, but it worked when speed mattered more than proper procedure. It worked because Australian soldiers understood intuitively that in combat, a gun that fires immediately is worth 10 guns that will fire perfectly after a 2-minute diagnostic sequence while the enemy overruns your position. The sound of the Bren became burned into the memory of every soldier who fought alongside it, a distinctive rhythm they could never forget. The cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute created a distinctive cadence, slower and more deliberate than the German MG-34, which fired at 900 rounds per minute in a continuous roar. You could hear the difference instantly across a battlefield. The German gun sounded like ripping canvas, a continuous tearing noise that spoke of overwhelming firepower. The Bren sounded like a hammer striking an anvil, each round distinct and separate. Experienced soldiers could identify a Bren firing at a distance of over a kilometre just by the sound signature. They could tell by the rhythm whether the gunner was experienced or panicking, whether the gun was running smoothly or struggling with a mechanical problem, whether this was suppressive fire or aimed fire at a specific target they could not see. Australian soldiers developed a dark humour about their relationship with the Bren that revealed the psychological stress they endured. They called it the Widow Maker because Bren gunners died at a higher rate than ordinary riflemen across every theater. Enemy forces always targeted the machine gun first as a tactical priority. The muzzle flash and sound signature made it impossible to hide once firing started, marking the gunner's position. Japanese and German snipers would wait for the Bren to open fire, then immediately target the gunner with precision. The life expectancy of a Bren gunner in heavy combat was measured in minutes, not hours, according to grim statistics. Sections would go through multiple gunners in a single engagement, each man stepping up to take the weapon from the hands of his fallen mate, knowing he would probably be next in line to die. But they did it anyway, and that fact seems incomprehensible to anyone who has not experienced combat firsthand. Knowing that picking up the Bren meant accepting a death sentence, soldiers still fought over the privilege of being the primary gunner in their section. It was the most important job in the section, the position that carried the most responsibility. The Bren gunner was the man who could save everyone else, the man who could break an enemy attack or cover a withdrawal under fire. In the social hierarchy of an Australian infantry section, the Bren gunner ranked second only to the sergeant in importance, and in combat situations, he might have been the most important person there keeping everyone alive. The physical toll of operating a Bren went far beyond simply carrying the weight across hostile terrain. The repeated recoil would bruise shoulders black and purple, leaving marks that lasted for weeks. The gas blowback from the ejection port would burn exposed skin and fill eyes with powder residue that caused temporary blindness and stinging pain. The heat from the barrel would cook any moisture in the immediate vicinity, creating a shimmer of superheated air that distorted the gunner's sight picture and made accurate shooting more difficult. Extended firing sessions would leave gunners with temporary hearing loss, their ears ringing for hours or days afterward in a constant, high-pitched whine. The bipod legs would dig into the ground with each shot, and gunners learned to position them on sandbags or rocks when possible. But in hasty defensive positions, they would simply accept that their supporting hand was going to get smashed against whatever surface they were firing from repeatedly. Maintenance of the Bren consumed vast amounts of time that soldiers desperately needed for rest and recovery. The official manual specified a complete field strip and cleaning after every engagement without exception. In practice, Australian soldiers cleaned their Brens constantly, obsessively, neurotically, with an attention to detail that bordered on religious devotion. They would strip the weapon down to its component parts multiple times per day, inspecting every surface for signs of wear, corrosion, or damage that could cause failure. They would spend hours picking grains of sand out of the gas system with improvised tools made from wire or splinters of wood. They knew that neglecting the Bren for even a few hours in harsh conditions could render it inoperable. And an inoperable Bren was a death sentence for the entire section when contact with the enemy was made. The training for Bren gunners in Australia before deployment was comprehensive by military standards, but completely inadequate for the reality of combat they would face. Recruits learned to field strip the weapon blindfolded, learning the location and function of every component by touch alone in darkened rooms. They learned the proper firing positions according to doctrine, the correct sight settings for different ranges, the approved methods for changing barrels and clearing stoppages by the book. They fired thousands of rounds on training ranges under ideal conditions, with unlimited ammunition and spare parts readily available. Then they arrived in North Africa or New Guinea and discovered that everything they had learned was wrong or irrelevant, or both when applied to actual combat conditions. The veterans taught the new arrivals the real skills that would keep them alive in ways no training manual could capture. How to judge the temperature of the barrel by spitting on it and listening to the sound the spit made as it evaporated instantly or slower. How to identify a failing recoil spring by the sound of the bolt carrier returning to battery with slightly less force. How to estimate range by the delay between the muzzle flash of an enemy weapon and the sound of the shot arriving at your position. How to position the bipod so that the gun could traverse across the maximum possible arc without having to reposition and expose yourself. How to load magazines in the dark by feel alone, counting the rounds by the pressure needed to compress the spring. These skills were never written in any manual because they could not be taught in a classroom or on a firing range under controlled conditions. They could only be learned in combat, and soldiers who failed to learn them quickly did not survive their first serious engagement. The role in Australian defensive tactics cannot be overstated when examining how battles were actually fought. British and American infantry doctrine placed machine guns in support roles, providing covering fire while riflemen maneuvered according to standard tactics. Australian doctrine, evolved through brutal experience and paid for in blood, made the Bren the center of everything tactical. Defensive positions were sited based on where the Bren could achieve maximum effect against likely enemy approaches. Patrols were planned around the effective range of the Bren and where it could support the patrol if contact was made. Withdrawals were covered by Bren gunners who volunteered to stay behind and hold the enemy as long as possible, buying time measured in their own lives. The entire tactical system revolved around the assumption that if the Bren was working properly, the section could hold against vastly superior numbers. If the Bren failed, the section died. It was that simple and that brutal. This created an enormous psychological pressure on Bren gunners that few other soldiers experienced in the same way. Every mechanical failure, every jam, every stoppage felt like a personal betrayal of the men depending on them for survival. Gunners would push themselves to the edge of heat exhaustion, and beyond that point, continuing to fire even when their vision was tunneling and their hands were shaking from dehydration. They would ignore wounds that would send riflemen to the rear for medical treatment, because leaving the gun meant potentially dooming their mates to enemy fire. The bond between Bren gunners and their weapon went beyond professional competence into something approaching obsession, or perhaps a form of combat madness that only other gunners could understand. The spare barrel system was theoretically brilliant in concept and practically nightmarish in execution under fire. Each gun came with at least one spare barrel that could be swapped out when the primary barrel overheated beyond safe operating temperatures. The barrel change mechanism was elegantly simple in design. Pull the carrying handle, rotate it 90 degrees, withdraw the hot barrel, insert the cool barrel, rotate the handle back, and you were ready to fire again within seconds. In training, this took about 5 seconds with a cold barrel. In combat, with a barrel hot enough to cause third-degree burns instantly, and enemies advancing toward your position firing at you, it took longer and required a level of manual dexterity that seems impossible under the circumstances of combat stress. Gunners learned to carry a glove or a piece of thick cloth specifically for barrel changes, because touching a hot barrel with bare skin meant instant severe burns that would put you out of action and endanger the entire section. But the spare barrels themselves created problems that added to the burden. Each barrel weighed over 2 kilograms and was nearly 60 centimeters long, an awkward shape that did not fit easily into packs or pouches designed for other equipment. Carrying 2 spare barrels plus the one on the gun meant hauling an extra 4 kilograms of metal across whatever terrain you were fighting in. Whether desert sand or jungle mountain, soldiers developed crude carrying solutions, lashing barrels to their packs with wire or rope, wrapping them in canvas to prevent them from banging against other equipment and making noise. The barrels would still manage to catch on vegetation, knock against rocks, and generally make moving through difficult terrain even more challenging than it already was. But nobody considered leaving spare barrels behind because a single barrel could only sustain about 200 rounds of continuous fire before becoming dangerously overheated and risking catastrophic failure. The effective range in Australian hands far exceeded the official specifications published in British manuals. The manual listed the maximum effective range as 550 meters under ideal conditions. Australian gunners routinely engaged targets at 800 meters and beyond, using the Bren almost like a sniper rifle with a very high rate of fire. This was possible because of the exceptional accuracy of the weapon and the skill of the gunners who spent countless hours mastering it. But it was also necessary because Australian units were frequently outnumbered and needed to inflict casualties at maximum range to survive encounters. Engaging at extended range meant adjusting the tangent sight to account for bullet drop, estimating windage based on experience, and controlling the trigger to fire single shots rather than bursts. It was precision shooting under combat conditions, and Australian soldiers became terrifyingly good at it through practice paid for with their lives. The Germans and Japanese both attempted to capture Australian Brens whenever possible for analysis and testing. Captured weapons were extensively tested and analyzed by enemy intelligence units seeking advantages. German intelligence reports from North Africa noted that Australian Brens showed extensive unauthorized modifications and were maintained to a higher standard than identical British weapons captured in other sectors. Japanese intelligence reports from the Pacific Theatre noted that Australian soldiers seemed to achieve a higher rate of fire and greater accuracy with their Brens compared to British or Indian units equipped with the same weapon in Burma and elsewhere. These reports concluded that the difference was not in the weapon itself, but in the training and mindset of the soldiers using it, a conclusion that Australian soldiers would have found grimly amusing given their contempt for formal training versus combat experience. The weapon continued to serve in Australian forces long after World War II ended, proving its worth across decades. It saw action in Korea, Malaya, and Vietnam, outlasting dozens of more modern designs that promised better performance. Australian soldiers continued to prefer it over newer weapons because they understood it intimately, trusted it based on experience, and knew its quirks and limitations better than any manual could teach. The later models were modified to fire the 7.62 mm NATO round instead of the old .303 British cartridge, but the basic mechanism remained unchanged from the original design. Soldiers who had carried the Bren in the jungles of New Guinea in 1943 were teaching their sons to use it in the jungles of Vietnam in 1966, passing on the accumulated wisdom of generations of Bren gunners who had learned their lessons in blood. The true measure of importance to Australian soldiers is found not in official histories or technical specifications, but in the memories of the men who used it in combat. In interviews conducted decades after the war, veterans would struggle to remember the names of officers or the details of specific battles that had faded with time, but they could describe their Bren with absolute clarity and detail. They remembered the serial numbers of their personal weapons decades later. They remembered the exact sound it made when functioning properly versus when developing a problem. They remembered the weight distribution and how it felt when carried over long distances in different terrains. They remembered every stoppage, every jam, every moment when it saved their lives or nearly failed them at the critical instant. The Bren killed more enemy soldiers in Australian service than any other weapon of World War II across all theatres. The exact numbers are impossible to calculate because combat reports rarely specified which weapon achieved which kills in the chaos of battle. But the anecdotal evidence from thousands of battle reports, after-action summaries, and personal accounts makes it clear that in defensive engagements, the Bren was responsible for the vast majority of enemy casualties inflicted. One Bren in the right position, operated by a skilled crew with adequate ammunition, could stop an infantry company and force them to break off their attack. This is not speculation or propaganda designed to boost morale. This is documented fact from battles like Tobruk, El Alamein, Milne Bay, and the Kokoda Track, where the records still exist. But the cost was staggering in human terms that statistics cannot capture. Bren gunners died in disproportionate numbers compared to other infantry roles. They suffered higher rates of injury from being deliberately targeted by enemy fire as priority targets. They experienced higher rates of heat exhaustion and dehydration from carrying the extra weight in brutal climates. They had higher rates of hearing damage from extended exposure to muzzle blast without adequate protection. They had higher rates of respiratory problems from inhaling powder smoke and cleaning solvents in enclosed spaces. The Bren demanded everything from the men who operated it, and they paid that price willingly because they understood that their sacrifice protected their mates from enemy fire and gave the section a chance to survive. The relationship between Australian soldiers and the Bren was complicated in ways that civilians struggled to understand, even when explained. They loved it for keeping them alive when properly maintained and operated. They hated it for the weight, the maintenance demands, the constant mechanical problems that plagued it in harsh conditions. They cursed it when it jammed at the worst possible moment during enemy attacks. They praised it when a single well-aimed burst broke an enemy attack and sent them retreating. They treated it with more care than they treated themselves, cleaning and maintaining the weapon even when they were too exhausted to eat or drink water. They personalized their guns with unofficial names and markings, treating them almost like living things, with personalities and moods that had to be accommodated. The Bren in Australian service was never just a weapon in the simple sense. It was a tool, a burden, a lifeline, and a symbol all at once, wrapped into 10 kilograms of metal. It represented the Australian approach to warfare, practical over theoretical, results over regulations, survival over glory or medals. It exemplified the relationship between Australian soldiers and their equipment, characterized by constant improvisation, unauthorized modifications, and making do with whatever was available regardless of official doctrine. It demonstrated the gap between what military planners in comfortable offices thought would work and what actually worked in the brutal reality of combat, where theory met practice and usually lost. The legacy in Australian military culture extends far beyond its technical specifications or combat record in official histories. It became part of the national mythology, along with slouch hats and the spirit of Anzac that defined Australian military identity. For generations of Australian men who served in World War II and subsequent conflicts, the Bren was a shared experience that created bonds deeper than words could express adequately. The weight of it, the sound of it, the smell of gun oil and powder smoke, the fear of it jamming, and the relief when it fired smoothly. These sensations were burned into memory with an intensity that peacetime life could never replicate or erase completely. In the end, the horrors were not the horrors of enemy weapons or battlefield chaos that filled nightmares. The real horror was the burden it placed on the men who carried it, knowing that if they failed, if the gun jammed, if they made a mistake in maintenance or operation, their mates would die because of it, and they would carry that guilt forever. That psychological weight was heavier than the 10 kilograms of metal and wood that bruised their shoulders. That was the burden that every Bren gunner carried every day of the war and for the rest of their lives afterward, in memories that never faded. The Bren saved Australian soldiers in countless engagements across multiple theatres, but it cost them more than anyone who has not carried one into combat could ever truly understand or appreciate fully.